in the churches is a dual application in the new covenant.
Rhett McLaughlin, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, man.
I can't believe you nearly interviews with drunk people on the streets, and it can go one of two ways. There are the funny ones when people are vulnerable in the sense that they might say something a bit stupid or whatever, and it makes for a funny viral moment. But also,
You're on, which is just self-sabotage, or there's Jesus. Never considering that, well, maybe there's a few more ways to think about these things.
Do you think there's pride in there? I mean, one of the worst sins a Christian can commit is the sin of pride. And I think they're constantly sort of battling against it, especially when you're in a position, I mean, let alone some of the people I talk to who have public platforms, constantly putting themselves in front of a microphone and answering people's questions and being constantly praised. It must be really difficult to not get prideful when it starts working. But even in an outreach situation like this, is there an element where it's sort of like, not like I'm better than these people, but like, look at me doing this good thing, walking into the depths of hell and harrowing it and getting everyone back to Christ?
Yes. I mean, I think that there's an element of sort of taking pride in the work that you're doing for God. Even though you can easily give God the credit, be like, the Spirit was working through me. Because if you know the code of humility, you know how to talk about these things, but secretly, you're thinking about how you're doing in relation to other Christians, and you're thinking about how they're doing in relation to you.
Yeah.
You can't, it's human nature. You're gonna do that. But I think there's another type of pride that I think back on those times. I remember a specific instance, and this is actually after I was no longer on staff with Campus Crusade, but I was still very active in the church, and I was leading a Bible study. And we had become friends with this couple that were Catholic, and in my estimation, Catholics weren't Christians. I mean, I was that type of evangelical.
Whoa,
yeah.
really?
I was like, well, maybe there's some that actually have a relationship with Jesus, but they believe, they believe that it's works and faith. It's not just faith alone, and so they don't have the grace thing figured out. At the very least, I need to introduce them to the real truth, right? And so I knew they were going to be there, and so I was like, well, I'm going to do a Bible study. I'm going to go to Galatians, right? Because Galatians talks about that, basically how it's about faith and sin, and not about works. And it was one of those things that, in retrospect, I was thinking about them, and everyone else in the Bible study, the other regulars, knew that I was kind of preaching to them from this perspective. And I think back on that, and I'm like, I brought a lot of spiritual pride to that situation because I thought I had the correct perspective, and just assumed they don't agree with me about this, and they're definitely wrong. I'm bringing them in to give them the truth. When you think that you've got the truth, and it's a truth that impacts everyone, it applies to everyone, it's really difficult to not take pride in that and to begin to see yourself as better. I mean, I'm not saying that all Christians think that they're better than people. I'm saying for me,
your experience,
I remember lying there when I was in college and thinking how grateful I was that I basically believed the right thing about everything.
Yeah, well, I often parody Christian denominations with that exact thought. It's like,
right.
what are the odds? How lucky you are.
And with no irony at all. Of course, I was, a 20-year-old kid, but I was lying there in bed and I was like, man, not only am I a Christian, but I am the right kind of Christian. Like, I believe the right stuff. I'm in the right denomination. I'm in the right ministry. Like, even amongst the ministries here on campus, I'm in the one that is the most serious about this. Yeah. It's like, I'm so thankful that I'm right about it. Essentially is what I'm saying.
Yeah, those are my nights. So grateful for being right about everything. It's fascinating. So there is an interesting paradox there, the so-called preppers paradox, where people can think that they're right about everything whilst also thinking they're wrong about at least one thing. It's called the preface paradox because at the beginning of the book, authors will often say, if there are any mistakes in here, I'm sorry. But they've gone through meticulously in every single one. So if I went through every single one of your beliefs individually and said, do you think this is true? Yes. Do you think this is true? Yes. So I'm going through your beliefs. So definitionally, every one of them say yes. But if at the end I then say, do you think at least one of those beliefs is actually false? If you're a bit humble in any respect, you go, yeah, of course, one of them's false. Yeah. So you've got this paradox of thinking they're all true, but at least one of them's false. It's got to be like probability.
Yeah, right.
Certainty. But yeah, there's that feeling that you've got God on your side as well, and you sort of go to sleep slightly prideful, slightly content, slightly happy. Where did that certainty come from? Was it the result of Bible study and consideration of different groups and denominations? Was it more sociological, just sort of the way you were brought up? Were you cognizant of the factors which led you to be in the correct denomination and the correct student group?
Yeah, so not at the time. I think that what I would have said is that I had been taught the right stuff from my parents, and I'd been in the right environment growing up. I think that ultimately there's a few factors that contribute to it. I think number one, certainty is a really important aspect of religious faith, and especially Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity. Because I think that agreeing with a set of propositional statements is actually if you ask somebody to describe, they might say, well, it's about a relationship with Jesus. But you're like, well, yeah, but what does that mean? These propositional statements come up. It's like, well, I believe this about Jesus. If any church worth its salt has a "we believe" place on their website, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I thought, right? And so I think that being certain and being right about these things comes at a premium. It is really, really important. So I thought that being certain was very important. And then I just think I had the type of personality, came from the type of family where we kind of thought we had it figured out, right? Like this is a big problem for me now, is to not settle on what I think I figured out, to be really doubtful of my particular perception. To say, well, I know that I'm wrong about some stuff. There's a lot of stuff that I'm not sure about. But I can struggle with wanting to latch on to certain ideas and go, well, I've got this figured out, and start trying to build this world. So I think it's a combination of the environment, where certainty was really important, and then my personality, the way that I gravitated towards that.
We'll get back to Rhett in just a moment. First, do you trust the news?
That it was probably some sort of... I basically became, without really reading too much about it, an annihilationist.
Yeah.
And so, just the idea that people don't know God, who are not His children, will probably go through some sort of torment, but it won't be forever, and they will cease to exist.
Yeah. That hell is, annihilationism is the view that people will be annihilated and they don't go to heaven, they sort of cease to exist, maybe after a period of suffering of some sort. I've always been quite attracted to that idea because of the classical tonistic arguments for the existence of God, which have God as the ground of being. If God is the foundation of being itself, and everything that is participates in Him, then if hell is something like separation from God, and if God is the ground of all being, then what does it mean to not be with God? It means to not be. It means to not exist.
Yeah, right.
So I've always thought philosophically there's good grounding for considering separation with God to be the same thing as not existing, because to exist is to participate in God's existence, as some of the classical philosophers. But that's not as motivational as the fire and brimstone imagery. And presumably in your outreach you wouldn't push too heavy on the hell stuff, especially considering that you've got most people going there anyway.
Yeah, right. And I think that it's interesting to see. I'm still a fan of Christian apologetics. It's fascinating to me to see the way that, especially now, there wasn't nearly as much just apologetics media as there is now when I was deconstructing, because this mostly happened to me in the late aughts of 2010, 2011. Nobody was there were people writing books, but nobody was making internet content about this stuff. But I kind of dip in and dip out, and to see the way the conversation around hell is evolving is fascinating, because it is a really, it's like if you're selling a product, it's like the one thing where we get all the bad reviews about this. It's like, should we keep talking about this one thing? It's the hell thing. So how do we rebrand hell? And the way that hell is being rebranded is smart. A lot of people are moving into this, annihilationism, but also there are people who just frame it as separation from God. It's just simply like you rejected God's love. That's not hateful for Him to say, well, now you're just going to be on your own and whatever that is to deal with your own stuff. And it sounds a lot nicer. It just sounds like you're just rejecting something. And I think that's become a pretty big talking point.
Yeah. What? Maybe this was one of them. But when did the dominoes start to fall over for you? How old are you, and what starts to happen? Because right now you're speaking past tense. So at some point you go from not just Christian, but really involved professional Christian. Yeah. Now you are. Where does this start?
So in my early 20s, the first couple of years out of school, I'm an engineer, civil engineer. I'm still very involved in Campus Crusade at the time. I'm not having that many, existential questions about it. If anything, I'm thinking about how I'm moving towards being a professional Christian, because my wife was still in college at the time. So Lincoln and I had kind of, we've been best friends since first grade 1984. So we kind of knew what we were working towards. And the idea that we were going to develop this ministry where we got to be funny and make our comedy videos, and we were really trying to find a way to do the thing that we loved for the cause that we loved.
So it sort of started as with God in the periphery here, like with all the video stuff, and it's all sort of directed towards, at least subtly to some degree, evangelism.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was a way to have my cake and eat it too, because I really wanted, we are entertainers at heart. We wanted to be filmmakers. We wanted to make things that, had significance culturally. We wanted to do that from the very beginning. So we always had our minds of on this idea that maybe we'll kind of, we can use this ministry, or we can have a ministry where we're doing these things that we love, and then maybe something that we make will be impactful enough so that we could one day, maybe we'll move to Hollywood and maybe we'll have a ministry there just through the things that we create. That was sort of the thought in the early days. So shortly after the engineering stint on staff with Campus Crusade, at that point, you're going to the staff training and you're taking the seminary classes and your initial, and I was always, I was not like a super deep student of theology, but I would say moderately deep, and there were certain ideas that I would gravitate towards and things that I like to think about and talk about. At that same time, I was given a book, and I never really thought about the intersection of science and faith. I think the way that I would describe it is, I think that most scientists are not Christians. Most scientists are atheists, and they've come up with some pretty wacky ideas to try to explain the world and why people are the way that they are, why the world is the way that it is. And they're mostly just desperate attempts to explain the world without God's word. So that whole thing about evolution and how long the world has been here, that's probably all BS. But I didn't think about anything like that. I wasn't like a staunch young Earth creationist. I didn't think about that issue in particular. But I picked up a book from an astronomer, Hugh Ross. And I'm sure, if I've mentioned this before, and he has a Christian ministry that is like very anti-evolution, but very pro-old universe from the standpoint of astronomy, which, obviously when you look at all the astronomical evidence and the speed of light and the size of the universe and all this stuff, the universe has been around for probably as long as the scientists are saying. But then he went on to essentially say that, but all truth is God's truth, and this is totally compatible with the Bible. But just so you know, evolution didn't happen. He was a proponent of something called progressive creationism, which essentially was, yes, the world's been around for as long as the scientists say, and these fossils we find are legitimate fossils that are approximately the date that they're saying they are. But God was creating new batches of creatures, special creations, different states throughout the history of the world, and ultimately resulting in the That's a great question. Great question. So I remember thinking, the first time I ever thought about making some reconciliation between what we observe in science and my belief about the world. And I just remember this doesn't
I'm sure I've met someone who probably like to use this whole universe well, I'm scientist, I'm astronomer, and there's no way I can redshift galaxies of 13.8 billion years old. But that evolution stuff and that other thing, biology that I probably never really seriously studied, that's all BS. And instead, God is just creating animals willy-nilly.
And there's animals that are getting more and more like a person before the people.
Yeah, it's like God is just a real file.
Right. Well, what does that say about God? Is what I was thinking.
Gets there eventually. That is a little bit strange. I suppose it's kind of biblical in the sense of like stretching out the story of Genesis over however long you needed, animals sort of popping out on different days and stuff like this. But yeah, the biggest problem for me that evolution poses to the Christians, and a lot of Christians today, accept evolution, like sure, people have common ancestors in the world. The biggest problem that I can propose is the seeming arbitrariness with which you have to say, presuming that our apish ancestors don't get to live eternal life. At some point, a mother gives birth to a child, and the child is morally condemnable to hell, but also potentially has the ability to inherit eternal life, but his mother doesn't. Right. And what difference is there? Maybe it's just a brute fact. Maybe God just breathed life into that particular organism. It just seems arbitrary and unfair. Yep. That person's suffering will now be redeemed, and it now means something to their mothers. It's the same organism, same suffering, same lifestyle, same everything. Dies like an animal. It just doesn't like to me. Unless you want to say the person who is developed as well, but that's
and so that's why I ended up going, right? Because when I didn't really buy into the progressive creationism thing, but I was so sure that evolution didn't happen. I was like, when you're raised in the Christian faith, and the only exposure to the idea of evolution you've ever had has come through the filter of a Christian scientist telling you why it's not legitimate. Somebody comes into your church and they're like, the evolution expert. They make it seem so impossible that you walk out of that with full affirmation of the idea that evolution definitely didn't happen. It's a horrible explanation. It will be debunked by the scientists themselves within our lifetime. Like, that's the kind of stuff that we right? We firmly believe it. But because of this proposal, this progressive creationist, the age of the universe and the age of the Earth, from geological, I've always been interested in geology, but from a geological standpoint, I was like, this isn't, like the way that Answers in Genesis has framed this issue is, I'm not going to say it's definitely disingenuous. I think it really just believe that. It has to, be consistent with the Bible, and so they're just willing to just completely reshape everything that they're seeing and the way of that. But I essentially was like, this doesn't make any sense. So then the idea of considering evolution, which just felt, I'm actually about to do this. And I was like, well, I think C.S. Lewis believes it. You start saying this, it's like, yeah, there's a lot of Christians who have like discovered evolutionists. Okay, so maybe there's something to this. So I read Francis Collins' book, The Language of God. And the thing that I took away from this book was that, well, evolution happened as well. And he touches on it a little bit. He talks about, in that book, I think, he talks about the second chromosome. I think he talks a little bit about retroviruses, and essentially, we've got the marks of the same retroviruses on our DNA that chimpanzees do. They're just these, again, there's no other way to see it. It's just like inexplicable things. Right. It's like if we're not related to every other animal on Earth, well, God certainly tried to make it seem like we are. Yeah. And so then, that was a huge moment for me. I remember coming home, still living in North Carolina. Again, a lot of people think that the story that is often told is that Nick and I were Christians, we came to Los Angeles, we were corrupted by this simple city we were aware of. And the reality, I've told it many times, but it's passed over, is that all this happened when I was aware. And this happened when I was completely buckled into the Bible Belt, as tightly as you can be, surrounded by people who believe about all these things. No social pressure to deviate from that. In fact, a lot of social pressure to stay together. So I was struggling a lot. I didn't have anybody to talk to about this. I remember talking to Link. I talked to Link about it a little bit, and he was just going to be like, sure. Like, it felt like learning a lot of things that like a young earth creationist background. That's what she was talking about. When I came home and I was like, we need to talk about something, and I said, I am thoroughly convinced that evolution is true and that we are related to every other animal. I believe in common ancestry, and I just think that it is not just, I sort of think it's true. It's just like my reading has led me to think that if this isn't true, then I actually can't determine what anything is true. It's so overwhelming. Because I'd read additionally to that, Sheeta starts crying. Because this represented, she knew what this represented. This was the seismic shift. And I think a lot of people that I tell this story to are like, what do you mean? There's all these Christians that believe in evolution. Like, I can't believe that this was so significant. But I think the reason it was is because at that point, I realized how wrong I could be about something so fundamental.
Yeah.
And I never, ever considered that I might be wrong about something so fundamental. And then, not only was I wrong, but all of these Christian apologists who were so sure about their critiques of evolution, they had missed the boat so significantly on this that suddenly I was like, can I trust anything else they've got to say about this? So that was the first big domino.
Yeah, it's significant, like you say. I mean, you might think, well, there are Christians who believe in evolution, but it depends which way you come at it. I mean, if you're somebody who's like a scientifically minded person who comes to faith in Jesus, you're not going to abandon evolution, but you might think, okay, I can make this all work. But if you come from the background you come from, it's like going up to your wife and saying, I just think maybe we should like live in separate houses. And your wife starts bawling. Someone says, some people do that. Some married couples, they live apart. So it's like, yeah, but what it represents to move from where we are now and the way we were living to having this kind of question or this kind of desire indicates a direction of thought, which you don't really want to entertain. Your wife, if I'm not mistaken, was a student of Bart Ehrman, Chapel Hill.
She was.
Right? And was this around this kind of time? Was she already being fed the atheist lies through her professor?
So, this was undergrad, at UNC. And she, at that point, this was before we even went on the staff at Campus Crusade. There was no questioning of anything. We both saw Bart as the enemy, right? This guy is coming and he's just decimating the faith of Christian students. And
with love.
Yeah.
He comes in with that chuckle.
So does Armin. And it's funny, I haven't met Bart. I want to, because I want to be able to tell him this story. Well, first thing that would happen is Jesse, my wife is, she's very passionate and she's very smart. And so she was a great defender of the faith when she was in it. And she would challenge him, right? And she would go up to him after class and be like, what about this or what about that? And then she would come and report back, this is what he said. I'm sure that there are many students who continued to have this strategy with him over the years. At the same time, there was somebody who was working with Campus Crusade at UNC who approached a couple years later when Link and I were already beginning to do our ministry work, who approached me and Link and said, we actually want to create some resources to counter what Bart is doing on campus, because we feel like we need to equip students better because they're going into these classes of his and having being confronted with these questions, and what can we do in terms of a multimedia project to address that. So we were actually beginning to have those conversations. It never became anything. I mean, how ironic would it be if I could dig up a video of me criticizing Bart from 20 years ago? I kind of wish we had done it just to have it now.
That'd be awesome.
But yeah, so there was never. I think that there was, especially in those days, in college days, there was zero curiosity about whether or not I think. That wasn't even a debate. There was full confidence and no curiosity. And I am in a very different place. I think those two things have reversed at this point in my life.
Right.
Very low confidence in my perspective and high curiosity for all of this stuff.
Yeah, I feel like that's been happening to me over the past few years as well. I think it's for the better. It's less entertaining and it's less fulfilling on a superficial level. It's nice to be able to, even when you're just talking to somebody, it's nice to be able to, at dinner, somebody asks you anything. I'll lay out, here's my beliefs and here's my thinking, let's have a discussion about it. It's less fulfilling to sort of go, you know what, man, I've got kind of no idea, but here are some thoughts. But I think it protects yourself against the kind of spiritual crisis which you inevitably run up against when that first domino starts to fall. And for you, it was evolution. You've said before that you used to kind of evangelize against evolution without having known very much about evolution. I mean, it sounds like the moment you started reading into evolution of its own accord, you became convinced by it. How do you navigate arguing against evolution if you haven't already engaged with that primary literature? I'm really intrigued when I heard you say that on some other show or something. It's like, well, I hadn't really learned about evolution, but I used to go out and argue against it. What arguments are you using? How do you do
Great
that?
question. First of all, it was a different time.
Yeah.
Anyone who's interested in these issues now can get, you could just ask ChatGPT to give you a primer on evolution. But all I had was, there was a few books, but one I remember, there was this, I can't remember the author's name, but the title was Icons of Evolution. And it kind of talks about the quote unquote best arguments for evolution, and he talks about why they're all corrupt. And so what I found is that, first of all, 99% of the people that I engaged with about this, where I was from, and at the time, knew nothing about evolution. Even if they were like, yeah, I agree with that because that's what the scientists say.
Yeah.
But then you're like, describe the mechanism of evolution.
It's like we come from monkeys, right?
Well, I had read enough to say things like, Okay, so you're saying that the primary raw material of evolution through natural selection are genetic mutations. So give me an example of a beneficial mutation. And at best, your beneficial mutation just causes a change in color. But give me an example of a new species.
Yeah.
You're like, that doesn't happen.
That stare is quite,
right.
Quite intimidating. Suddenly I'm thinking, is evolution true? I don't know.
Right.
Man, I don't know, man.
And so I just had those back pocket, and then I would say things like, take for instance, if we took all, you have this concept that you put organisms into different environments and they suddenly become, they adapt to different environments. But what if we were to take all of the dogs in the world and put them out into the wild? What would happen? We would have a convergence to a type of canine that could survive in the wild. And it wouldn't be my little poodle, and it wouldn't be the Great Dane. It wouldn't be these extravagant dogs that we have created through artificial selection. It would be the one that adapts to the environment, and that would probably look like a wolf. End of story. Evolution doesn't happen. And most people who don't know anything about it are like, oh, okay, I guess it doesn't happen.
Yeah. It's easy enough to do when somebody really, really just doesn't know. Because I think most people are at that position where they kind of know that evolution is this thing and it's got something to do with genetics and environment selection, but all you need is like one good counterexample or question that can't be answered, along with that confidence.
Yeah.
And those eyebrows.
Yeah, the eyebrows are key.
The eyebrows and the confidence, and there's something about the fact that you're doing this kind of professionally as well. Like if they know, oh, this is a guy who's part of this organization and whatnot, they're probably thinking, even if I had an answer, he'll have heard it because he does this every day.
Right,
and so like there's just something about that confidence which is going to be quite off-putting for people. But presumably those questions start to get answered for you by the reading that you're doing. And was it, I mean, you said it was Francis Collins' book. Is there a moment where you're reading it and like your mind goes to those apologetical arguments that you make and you're like, oh, that doesn't work?
Yeah, I'm like this, there's not an explanation for this. And of course, you can do that. You can, every single one of these things, there's a page on the Answers in Genesis website for everything that we could talk about related to evolution. So they've got their perspective on the second chromosome and the fusing of that chromosome. They've got their perspective on these retroviruses. And I think I was getting to a place where I no longer, I would essentially, I read their responses and I was just like, this can't be right. Like they have to be wrong about this. Like this is not a good faith argument. This is not a good faith answer, And that's when it started dawning on me, okay, I began to notice a pattern, and I think maybe I didn't even realize I was noticing a pattern yet, but this is the pattern that started then and then propagated itself throughout my entire deconstruction. And that is, there's a type of answer that someone gives when their allegiance is to the truth that they need to be true. And there's a type of answer that people who are actually interested in the truth give. And what I kept finding is that Christian apologetics, really consists of people who are like, well, the truth cannot be questioned. The truth, we've predetermined that this is true. And now we've got to find a way to buttress that truth. And there's a tenor to those arguments that they don't hold up very well under scrutiny. When you get the answer to the answer to the answer to the answer, you just keep finding, like, it just seems like these people seem to be interested in what actually happened, and these people seem to be interested in the truth that they hope to happen. And that was a huge flip for me, because again, as a Christian, what I thought is, we have the truth. They have the desperate attempt to be anti-God, right? We were taught that these evolutionists, these professors who are teaching this kind of stuff, like they're sinful, they're deceived, they desperately don't want God to exist, so therefore they got to come up with these ideas in order to explain them away. But when you're like, actually, first of all, most of these ideas came from Christians. The age of the earth, these geologists back in the day, these were just, most people were Christians. It's just the fact of the matter. And they were like, oh, God must have done it in this way. Yeah. And then when they find evolution, okay, God must have done it in this way. And so the scientific stuff, there were plenty of people who taught me, like, it's okay, you can believe that. You can be a theistic evolutionist. You probably still need to believe in a literal Adam and Eve because the atonement still needs to make sense. Original sin's got to make sense. And I was like, okay, yeah, those arguments seem like we're just trying to marry two disparate ideas. Yeah. But I was like, okay. But I just think that mentality of finding that the people, because it got into biblical scholarship after that. It got into, okay, well, primeval history. So this is allegory. Like, this didn't happen. These were religious myths that were adapted from other myths that were around at the same time. Mm-hmm. The flood didn't happen. Yeah. The Tower of Babel is a weird explanation for language. I started seeing all that, so I was like, okay, now my entire view of the beginning of the Bible is different. And again, I would go to the apologetics answer, and I would be like, one person seems to be, like, the critical scholars actually seem to be, like, interested in what happened. Like, why did these people write this? Why is it like this? Where did this idea come from? And then the Christian apologists seem to be like, well, we know it's God's word, so how do we prove it? Mm-hmm. And it just kept creeping closer and closer to Jesus. And I had this, like, this was years, right? Because I was like, well, I'm not going to stop believing in Jesus. You can have these weird ideas about the Old Testament, but, like, Jesus is different. I mean, I have a personal relationship with him, and, and that stuff's true, right? Stuff about the resurrection, my arguments for why the resurrection had happened, and it being the best explanation for the beginning of the church and all this. I had those arguments in my back pocket. But But long story short, eventually those arguments fell victim to the same type of critique. They're a little bit different because I do think that there's a more interesting conversation around the resurrection because you can kind of know a little bit less about what happened. And you can be somebody who believes all this stuff about that I might agree with related to evolution, but then be like, I have a faith position that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I recognize that it's not a scientific thing, I can't prove it. It is a little bit different category. But it opened me up to questioning these sacred ideas. And it's just the most sacred idea of all that Jesus was the Son of God who raised from the dead eventually was the last domino to fall.
Wow. And how does that finally fall? I mean, because the evolution thing confronts, and I think the reason why it was so scandalous in the 19th century is kind of just a vibe shift, right? Because when you speak to philosophically minded Christians, they will quite correctly say there is no argumentative syllogism you can construct which shows that because animals have a common ancestor, therefore God doesn't exist. That doesn't follow. There's no argument you can make from that. But it's hard to put into words just like the feeling. Again, it's like we were saying before about the indicating a direction of thought. When a society is based upon the idea that human beings are special and unique.
Yeah.
This idea, if you're smart, it doesn't need to undermine the idea that God exists, but it shows this direction of thought, like, oh gosh, we're not as special as we thought we were, and where's that going to lead? I'm pretty sure that in the first edition of The Origin of Species in 1859, that beautiful ending, there is grandeur in this view of life from many different species, whatever it is, having been breathed into many lives or into one, have been and are being evolved. And there's that phrase, like having been breathed into one or to many, primordial forms of light. And presumably because of the backlash that this idea receives in the second edition of The Origin of Species, having been breathed by the creator into one life or to many, Darwin defaced the ending, his moving ending to The Origin of Species. And I think by edition 3, it was back.
An aspect gradations of liberal or progressive Christian. And everyone laid out their case with a lot of confidence and a lot more scholarship and knowledge than I have about the subject. But it was so gray. And I just started, this feeling began to creep in, which was like, okay, well, maybe he did rise from the dead, but what I've learned about the process of historical investigation and also just the nature of human psychology and the nature of religious movements and the nature of people's willingness to believe things, like it began to dawn on me that I don't know exactly what happened with Jesus. I don't know specifically the nature of his death. Like, was he left on the cross? Was he thrown into